found in our Iowa magazine. We just put it up here for you to see. And so now, am I right, we should know everybody who's in that picture. Is that right, Kathy? Now that the 3 mystery people, and that came from Florida, it was amazing. So I just thought that was a wonderful, if there is such a thing as coincidences, that was a wonderful coincidence. Okay, next week at Brown Bag Lunch on the 15th, Philip Bowen is coming back, and he's going to be talking about diaries, and he's deciphered a number of diaries from the 1930s, and so he was going to be talking about diaries next week. And this week, we're going to talk about the steps of Maquoketa Post Office, which we were going to talk about last week until Bill Mueller came. And that was such a neat opportunity to be able to hear him a second time. We couldn't pass that up. So we scrambled things around, but we're pretty scrambled anyway. So this week, steps of Maquoketa Post Office. And what I'm hoping is that you'll be thinking of some names that you can add to this as we go along. But, you know, like some of you, I walk up the steps of our post office several times a week. I go get the museum's mail every week. And as I'm walking up those steps, I think back, you know, I wonder how many times I've done this. And I was gone for 40 years and didn't do that. And those of you who lived here all that time, obviously went up and down those steps many more times than I did. So it's just, I think about, gee, how many people walked up these steps? My grandparents, my great-grandparents? How many people can I think of that went up and down those wonderful post office steps that I would just like to stop and chat with? I'm late for work a lot of times because I stop at the post office on my way, and there's always somebody that stops you and, oh, I've got something to donate to the museum, or, you know, they have a story to tell you. I think that happens to, that kind of thing happens to all of us. And so just thinking, who would you like to talk to as you walk up those steps of the post office? Who would you just like to stop and chat with? But I thought before that, we would do a little background on our post office. And
I'm not quite sure how to get,
okay. It's going to be an interesting brown bag lunch. So, picture of our wonderful post office. It was just getting dark, and it's just a very special place to me. But as most of you know, our first postmaster of the Springfield Post Office, because we were Springfield before we were Maquoketa, that first post office opened on June 4th of 1840. Jane Goodnow kept the post office. He kept it in a large boot box under his bed in his log cabin. And of course, his log cabin was at the corner of Main and Platt Street. And he was a busy man. He was probably hardly ever there. And so patrons would just, they knew that they could just walk in the cabin, and it was kind of the hotel of the place. It was the Goodnow Inn. They would just walk in, everybody knew where the boot box was. They would look under the bed, they would help themselves to their mail, and they'd leave a quarter behind for every piece of mail that they got. And it was just kind of interesting to note that back in the day around here, there was no money. In 1840, no one had money. And so furs and things like that were legal tender to pay your local taxes, things like that, but they could not be used to pay Uncle Sam. So you could not pay your postage with furs or something like that. Coonskin caps did not pay postage.
Probably a good thing.
When the Whig Party took control in 1841, the post office was moved to Bridgeport. I forget to tell Sue. Okay, so there's our friend Jane Goodnow, father of Maquoketa, and he was the first postmaster. And then we see Anson Wilson. He has a relative here. One of my favorite people in Jackson County history, so I like to talk about Anson Wilson. But in 1841, the Whig Party gained control of the federal government, and they moved the post office to Bridgeport. So Maquoketa had this post office, and then all of a sudden they didn't. And Anson Wilson, who was one of the best historians that we have, because he came here as a teenager, very, very early on when Jay Goodnow and those people were just arriving. And he lived to a very ripe age. And he had a wonderful memory. And the thing that's most important about him, I think, is that he never had an agenda. He told things exactly as they are. He didn't elaborate. He didn't point things in different directions. And so when J.W. Ellis wrote the 1910 history, he had lived, he came here when he was 3 years old. He didn't remember all of that. So he went to people like this man, and he got their stories, and that's what he used to write the 1910 history. But Anson Wilson, later on in his life, left an account of his experiences of this time. So he said that, and these aren't his exact words, but he said that travelers stopping by the Goodnose Inn, J. Goodnose's cabin, left word for him that there was a letter at the Bridgeport post office for him, and immediately he walked after it. Although it was November, the river wasn't yet frozen, and so he took all his clothes off, he put them in his coonskin cap, and he swam the Maquoketa River in November. He had not heard from his family in Canada for many months. So you can imagine, he's telling us how disappointed he was to learn that his family had spent 25 cents to mail this letter to him. There he was at the Bridgeport post office, but he didn't have 25 cents to get the letter. So he had no money. So he tried to get a job. He tried to earn the money. He even tried to sell his coonskin cap, but he had no takers because no one had money. And so finally, he walked. Now remember, he's at Bridgeport. So finally he walked to Buckhorn. You know where Buckhorn is, way west of town. He walked to Buckhorn. And when he got there, he picked corn for Shadrach Burleson for 3 days. He obtained his pay in corn. So there he was. He worked for 3 days. He had corn. And then he had to take that corn to the mill and sell it to the mill. The mill was out by Horseshoe Pond. It was the McCoy Mill, out by Horseshoe Pond. And so he took the corn there. There, he got his quarter. Then he had to start all over, back to Bridgeport, swim the river, pay his quarter, get his mail. So you can just see kind of what it was like back then. And I'm grateful for Norma Round because she gave us some very wonderful pictures of Anson Wilson, who is related to her husband's family, right? And so she has a lot of great history about Anson Wilson. He was just an awesome guy. Okay, so pretty soon the post office returned to Springfield, and then you all know the story how in March 13th of 1844, the town's name was changed to Maquoketa. And that's because there were too many Springfields in the country. Every state had a Springfield. The federal post office was getting completely confused. They didn't have computers to get them confused. They just got confused.
Oh, I thought you know.
That's okay. They were just completely confused. And so they asked that we change the name of our town. So J. Goodnoe was in charge. They wanted something really unusual, one of a kind, right? So they picked Maquoketa. We're supposedly the only Maquoketa that there is. But in Anson Wilson's day, mail was brought on horseback by Ansel Briggs. And we all know that Ansel Briggs was the first governor of Iowa, right? And he held the government contract for a Davenport and Dubuque mail route. And he passed this way through Maquoketa 3 times a week. He carried all of our mail in his saddlebags. Later, he got his stagecoach routes set up, and he had that contract, and he brought it by stagecoach. And then starting in 1870, and for over 50 years after that, the mail was brought in by the railroads. So that's how Maquoketa got their mail. So what we see here is then, all these years, the post office is under J. Goodnoe's bed. But this is the second post office that Maquoketa had. And it was in this is an awesome photo of the Pierce Mitchell store. So you have to imagine that right over here sat J. Goodnoe's cabin, right? But you see the space between the Pierce Mitchell store and the Trout and Munger store, hardware store that sells stoves there. There's an empty lot there. Well, on that empty lot, the town built the second post office. In those days, you built your own post office. And so that was, it was 1869 that they built a post office there. But the location of the post office, because you had to furnish your own post office, changed often. After that, it was located in a small building on Pleasant Street. where Chuck Hensley later lived, but I don't know where that was. Moved to the building that housed Skogmo's back in the day, later to the Cook Block just north of the Lane Furniture Store. So, here we see, and I just found this picture yesterday. I think it's really fascinating. It'll be a little clearer. I think we need to focus a little bit. Mary and I have agreed that this is a test program, and it's really a test program. So Mary?
Oh, this
So if you just, the two little things on the,
top here.
yeah, squeeze them back together or apart a little bit, I think it can be focused better. Maybe not. It was a good picture.
That's it. It's straight up and down. It's there.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, so, new picture that I have not seen before, and this is a postcard. It was very clear, wonderful postcard. And you can see, maybe you can't, but I could blow it up. On the top, the sign on the top said that it's the Stevens block, and that large brick block, you can see that there were 3 stores. On this side, nearest me, was the Lane Furniture Store. And then where it says hardware, that was one of the locations of the Ringlook hardware store through the years. It moved around quite a bit. And then that last building, in the big brick building next to the white building, that was the post office. So our post office was there, and everybody was happy. It was a wonderful post office, and it was in a really nice place, and it got along fine until December 4th, 1915, and we don't know the date on the other picture, but December 4th, 1915, probably one of the very worst fires ever in Maquoketa, destroyed that whole Stevens block, and it also was called the Cook Block at one time. And so the Lane and Buckner Furniture Store burned, the post office burned. It was really a sad day for Maquoketa. So that's what happened to that post office. They wanted everybody to know that, the Pastime Theater was also there, and the Pastime Theater burned. But they wanted everybody to know that even though the post office burned, no mail was destroyed because they got the mail out as the building was burning. You can see that Dr. Ellis, Dr. Ellis's dental offices were upstairs in that building, and his offices were destroyed. And he's the one that discovered the blaze because it started in an apartment that was next to there. The estimated loss was $65,000, which in today's, would have been a lot more if it were today. And rebuilding started almost immediately. Okay, so then they had to find a new place. They had to find a new place for the post office, right? And we all know about Becker bricks. We always talk about this being the historic corner of Maple and Clark Street, where Jacob Becker had his brick factory. He made bricks for all of the big old buildings in town, for the old courthouse in 1873, for the Decker House in 1876, the Hearst Hotel in 1879, Old City Hall in 1902. But he erected this building called the Mammoth Building in 1884 on South Main Street, kind of right across from the Hearst Hotel. And it had stores on the bottom, on the lower level, and upstairs there was a large opera house. At first it was called the Odeon Opera House. A little later, as you can see, it was called the Grand Opera House. And it cost $17,000 to build that building. And it was sold then, and that was in 1884. 1896, it was sold to Mortimer Rice for $8,000, quite a discount there. And Mortimer Rice operated a store on the building next to it, and then it became the Rice Opera House upstairs. And at the other museum, we have a lot of really fine artifacts that came from the Rice Opera House. Okay, so Mortimer Rice built the post office in his lower building there. And there's a lengthy newspaper article that tells how wonderful it was. It says, while awaiting the first federally funded post office to be built in Jackson County, Mortimer Rice furnished a new post office in his building on South Main Street, and it's where the Goodwill is now. He purchased all new equipment. The fixtures installed were fresh from the cabinet maker of solid, richly grained oak with the greatest convenience to both employees and patrons. And the newspaper article assured the public that the expenditure made by Mr. Rice in procuring a modern, durable, and beautiful fixtures was a wise one, for it's beyond all question that when the new federal building is ready for occupancy, the government will be able to utilize the entire equipment. And Mr. Rice will make but very little financial sacrifice, for it's unlikely that Uncle Sam would or could better the style, design, or arrangement that has been installed by the present owner. So we had a very elaborate post office in this building at one time. And I think there's another picture of this. Well, we don't have a good picture of the post office, but you can see the Hearst Hotel across the street. Look how narrow the street is now. You can see the Hearst on the right, and you can see where it says Grand on that sign. That's where the Grand Opera House was up above. And where the canopy is, that was Mortimer Rice's store, where he built, for the town of Maquoketa, at his own expense, he built a post office. So then we have okay, so in 1910, the federal government decided to build a post office in Maquoketa. The federal government started providing post offices. Up until then, it was up to the local people to provide their post office. So in 1910, the federal government purchased land on North Main Street, which had been a private park. And somewhere there's a picture of that private park, and I could not find it. But it was a beautiful park with a little fountain in the middle, and that's where they chose to put the post office. In 1913, Congress appropriated $50,000 for the actual structure, but then, of course, it was delayed. Why? 1913, because of World War I. So there was no building that went on at that time. Finally, in 1917, the cornerstone was laid, the building was constructed, and our post office, as we know it now, was opened in 1918. That's our current post office. So I had to think to myself, what would some of our early pioneers have thought about this building? The ones that maybe got their mail under J. Goodman's boot box under his bed. What would some of these pioneers have thought? And I'm sure some of them would have thought that it was very frivolous, a waste of money, you know how that is. But I don't think any of them would have opted to go back to the days when the post office was in Bridgeport and they had to follow Anson Wilson's steps in order to get a letter. I don't think any of them would have wanted to do that. Okay, so back to the steps of the post office and who climbed them. So I was just going to tell you about a couple people from our past. We need to look at the rest of the pictures of this is the post office being built in the spot it is now. It's interesting to look at the buildings that you can see in the background. Some of the old houses and things that were there in 1917 that are no longer there. There's two more, I think, Sue. So there's the post office going up. The Hearst there to the left. Decker? Oh, Decker, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. And look at the brick street. Those bricks that got covered over and just taken up just recently. So, and then there's one more, I think. And there's the post office comes up. Anybody remember what that little white building on the far side is?
That's the
Salvation Army building. Yeah. So that's our post office. And every time I go in, Tom tells me about the big pine tree that's
There.
south of the post office, that came from Clinton Engines. That big pine tree was transplanted there from Clinton Engines. Okay. So, back to the people who climbed the steps. A lot of the people that I'd like to talk to were gone by 1917. Those are the people that I find so interesting. Anson Wilson was one of them. They were gone by 1917. But maybe the person I would like to chat the most with, and I'm going to tell you a couple of my people, and then I'm hoping that you will tell us some of the people that you might like to talk to, was J.W. Ellis, the man who wrote the 1910 history book. And he, like I said, there he is. He came here when he was 4 years old. He grew up near Hurstville. As a young boy, because he lived near Hurstville, he collected arrowheads and he collected fossils, and he got so interested in history, and he enlisted in the Civil War when he was 16 years old. And he also fought in some of the Western wars, and he fought with General George Custer. He was too young to have experienced our early days, like I said, of the history. But he wrote the Annals of Jackson County, which are so important to us now, and of course that two-volume history. But a lot of it was based upon stories of people, the older people around that he knew and trusted. He established the Ellisonian Museum. You can see the tickets there. It was in the 100 block of South 2nd Street. This one was toward the end, and it was other places before that. But you have to remember that this was an early time. He collaborated with the Smithsonian Institute. They were the Smithsonian, the Ellisonian. They came about at the same time, and he traded back and forth with these people, and he collaborated with them. And I think that's an amazing thing, because the Smithsonian Museum is really amazing. And he's known for his exhibits of Native American artifacts, of course, and he collected weaponry of all sorts. He also had, he called his museum the Museum of Curiosities and Oddities. And that's because he had a lot of connections with World War II soldiers who were fighting in the Philippines and things like that. They would send him strange things like shrunken heads and all kinds of strange, So he had a lot of strange things in his museum, but he also had a lot of wonderful historic things. And one of the things he had in his museum that this museum has become very much a part of was he somehow obtained some of the rifles that were confiscated by the Army after the Battle of Wounded Knee, North Dakota, I think. Once they left Maquoketa, but he managed to get those from the Rock Island Arsenal because he had such great connections with everybody. So he had, we believe, he had 8 of those guns in his collection. And when he passed away, his collection went to his son Frank, who had the Ellis Museum, which was a little bit more serious museum. He didn't have the oddities and the curiosities. He focused in on the Native American artifacts and the weaponry. In this collection that the two men collected together, there were weapons from the Bellevue War, pretty important in our history. There were weapons from, like I say, the Battle of Wounded Knee. And all of those things were packed up when Frank Ellis died, were packed up and shipped away from Maquoketa, sold at auction. Now it wasn't either of the Ellis's wish that this happened. They wanted this stuff to stay in Jackson County. But they had kids, and kids like money, and I'm sure there were a lot of reasons. But all those things were packed up and shipped away from here. In that process, the rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee ended up on the market, on the circuit of the weapons circuit. And in the last probably 10 to 15 years, 3 at least of those weapons, those rifles, have been purchased by individuals around the country. And they came with a tag on them, tied on with a little piece of twine that had the name of the Indian brave whose body this gun was taken from, and a little information, and it had the Ellisonian Museum's information. And so these collectors spend big bucks for these guns, and then they want more history, because the more history they have, the more valuable their artifact is. So they started contacting us, wanting to know, what do we know about these weapons? Well, unfortunately, we knew very little, other than the fact that he did have them, and he had them in his collection. But it turned out to be a really neat thing, because I got a call from a man named Tommy Haas, who was one of the people that purchased one of those guns from Maquoketa. And in fact, he has 3 of those guns now, maybe more by now, because he travels around and that's what he collects, and he's trying to buy them. So we talked on the phone many times. And that turned out to be very fortuitous for us because Tommy Haas was at a gun show not too long ago in Las Vegas. And while he was there looking at all these wonderful artifacts for sale, and along with all the weapons and things, there's usually a collection of Civil War artifacts, muskets and things like that. And so he's looking at all of these artifacts and he sees a sword that has on the scabbard is engraved from the people of Maquoketa, Iowa. Whoa. So I knew about that because Helen Rockmore and Rich Rockmore discovered that, otherwise I wouldn't even have known. But because Tommy Haas and I had had all these conversations, he thought, wait, Maquoketa, I know Maquoketa, never been here. I know Maquoketa. So 3 days later he calls me and he says, do you know anything about a sword from the people of Maquoketa? And it was like, oh, well, yes. And he said, well, I saw it at a gun show, but he said, I was with my buddies and we were going from show to show and I can't quite remember where it was. So he had to get all of his friends together. They finally figured out it was in Las Vegas. By then he was in Salt Lake City. So he drove back to Las Vegas. He bought it. He bought that sword for us. And then he said to us, if you want this, and he knew we had to raise the money because we just can't buy things. If you want this, I will sell it to you for exactly what I paid for it. So talk to the board, talk to the Rockmores, talk to everybody, and we decided, yes, we could get the sword. And so it's because of the Ellisonian Museum and these guns that we even knew about this wonderful artifact that now has come back to us. And some of you were at our annual meeting, and you went back and you've seen the sword that Rich and Kevin and all of our volunteers have put in that exhibit. And the wonderful story on the boards that Helen has created for that. It's wonderful history. I look at it as solely Jackson County history. Nobody can tell that story but us. It's our history. So it's such a wonderful thing. So I am just so happy with J.W. Ellis. Can't tell you. And so I would like to stand on the steps of the Maquoketa post office and talk to him and ask him questions about all this. We don't know how he got those weapons from the arsenal to Maquoketa, because that should never have happened. I mean, they just don't pass out their weapons, you know. We don't know how all this came about, but I want to ask him. So he's somebody that I want to talk to. And this was his first, where he had his Ellisonian Museum. He was related, and I don't remember just how, to the Ellises that are dentists. And this was the dentist office at first, and he had his museum there. And if you can manipulate that picture a little bit more, you can see that it says Ellisonian Museum on the sign. So, he was just a fascinating guy.
Is that on North Main?
That was on Pleasant Street.
Oh, Pleasant, okay.
Right? Pleasant Street, I believe.
Okay.
Yep. It was. So, does anybody want to share? Does anybody want to share somebody that have you thought of somebody that you might like to talk to? That you just like to mention? That would have been on the steps of the Maquoketa Library? Somebody who had to have been around 1918 and later. All right, be thinking. I'm going to tell you one more. Oh, Erlene, thank you.
I still remember Red Hinton because he was a postmaster.
Absolutely.
And anyway, he every time I'd go to work at the newspaper office, he'd say, "Well, I see you're on your way to the salt mine, you know." And he joked around, you know, about it and everything. But you know, I still remember him, you know, telling me that.
Telling you that.
So, and it was on the steps of the post office.
He told you that on the steps of the post office sometimes. Thank you. Okay, so be thinking. So the next person that I would like to talk to is Tom Smith and Kate Smith. And some of you may have known them, okay? During vacation season, Tom, and this is Tom hanging from the trapeze, and he is holding Kate Smith. Kate Smith was from Maquoketa. Kate Smith was Kate Becker, and she was Jacob Becker, who built all the bricks. He had his brick thing here. She lived in the house at the top of the hill that he built that we know as Briarwood, or I don't know what it is now, but that was Kate Becker, and she married Tom Smith. Tom would come to Maquoketa summers, and he would practice all of his circus acts and things. They traveled all over the country and even to other countries, doing all of their acts. But in Maquoketa, he would come here. He would work out with Beach and Bowers Minstrel Show. They would practice all their circus routines and things during the winter, I should say. And then in the summer, they would go around and put on their acts at different places. It was around 1890, and I was surprised to learn this, but Matt and Ed Luckish were also part of this troupe. But in April 14th of 1903, Tom married Kate Becker, and they did this high wire act. This is at the Maquoketa Fairgrounds that you see this happening. She always liked to talk about her circus days. They traveled by circus train. She liked to describe the elegance of the Pullman cars and things that they lived in as they traveled around. And their biggest thrill, she said, came when their circus performed in Maquoketa, because she loved performing in her hometown. They were always at the Jackson County Fair, or often at the Jackson County Fair. And Tom always liked to tell the tale that how the show was so big, the circus train that came in was too big to fit on the siding. And it came in, you know, where the Y is. That was Jay Goodnow's farm that was there. And the railroad came through there from Delmer. And the circus train would come in, and people from town would go sit on the hills, and they'd watch the elephants unload the tents, and then there'd be the big circus parade through town down to the fairgrounds or wherever the fair was at that time. So they loved to come here and do that. But he always talked about that circus train being cut up into sections. They could only bring part of it in at a time, because it was 35-car train, and they were 80-foot cars, which is longer than a regular freight car. They also told about a lot of, they told about a lot of neat experiences during their Big Top days. Some were a little wild, like one time they were in Dixon, Illinois, and a stray dog frightened the elephants. And the elephants began rampaging around the show area and just devastated the tents and the concession stands and tore up trees by the roots and all kinds of things, just terrorized the local people as well as the circus troupe. They eventually rounded up the elephants, but there was considerable damage done. And then on another occasion, one of the circus members forgot to close the lion's cage. And I don't know where that happened, but the wild animals escaped and they began roaming around the neighborhood. And they were big animals, said Tom, 8 foot long. And when they came after you, they looked like they were a mile long. But they rounded them up, and they did it using flashlights, if you can believe. They had flashlights, and they would shine them in the cat's eyes, and they would get disoriented. And that's how they were able to get them all round up and back in the cages. But they had just tons and tons of experiences that I would like to talk to them about. So I would like to have met them on the steps. And then, of course, Kate Becker went on to, she took over her mother Anna's nursing home that was up here on the corner. Part of it was the Becker Hospital for a while. It became the Becker Nursing Home, Old Folks Home. So that was that Kate Becker. Her career was ended when she fell off the high trap. She fell walking a tight wire, and she broke her arm badly. And her arm never healed correctly, so at that point she retired, and then soon after he retired, and then moved back to Maquoketa. And there's one more, we have a lot of pictures, but there's one more. They had a famous dog, and I guess you'd probably call it a dog and pony show, which is a real thing back in the day. So there he is with his dog act that he took all over the world, really. And some of the artifacts from this we have down at the museum that have been given to us. The other thing that some of you will remember, do you remember, Linda? They brought the ponies. So when they ended their circus career, they had all of these circus ponies. And they couldn't bear to leave them behind. They didn't know what would happen to them. They brought them back to Maquoketa. So at that time, this was a clay pit. The Becker Clay Company had stopped. I mean, they were no longer making bricks here. But as I remember, and maybe Linda remembers, and a few other people remember riding their ponies. He's very smart, got the neighborhood kids to come and ride the ponies. That exercised his ponies. So we would come over 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we would come over. This wasn't a nice flat ground,
It was that big ditch there.
it
And
was.
didn't they live in the brick house that's next to where it's gone now, where Brent
Yes.
Nugent lives? So if you know where Brent Nugent lives now, that was a great big hole
It was.
at one time, and that's where the ponies were. And you could come up there and ride the ponies.
Thank you. My favorite was Black Beauty. I remember. But when you were riding those ponies, you were down kind of in a ravine, and the sides of the were higher than your head. I mean, it was really rugged. But I believe that was from digging out all the clay from that clay pit. So that was the Smiths, and I want to talk to them. There are also pictures. They had a wonderful. It was probably a trailer, maybe like a circus trailer, and they made it into like a big dollhouse, and they would have the kids in the neighborhood in for tea parties and things like that. They loved children. They had no children, I don't believe. And they loved children, and so that was all just right here in the neighborhood. And lots of people remember doing that. Okay, by now, I think that's all of those. That's great. So, by now, surely you've thought of someone that you would like to talk about that.
Owen McCaffrey.
Oh, of course. Okay, what would you ask? So if you didn't hear, she said Owen McCaffrey. Of course, he was the cigar maker in town.
I think I would like to know, like if something happened in that building, because we had, different apparitions and stuff, and just wondering, with the different encounters that we had with,
Hauntings.
Yeah, hauntings and the apparitions and the sounds, and just wondering,
Lots of
if there's
things to
some
ask.
story there to tell us about what happened. And there just was, at our bar, there was someone that was, different people would, several people have seen someone sitting there that, obviously wasn't there. And then in the hallway, a little girl swinging her legs, and just wondering about those things.
Sure. Lots of questions to ask him. All right. Anybody else? You're so shy. Nobody else?
Maybe D.H. Anderson, like the Hallmark store building.
Awesome.
After all the working there, like there was a dance hall up above, and like if you need to know more about the building and even his house that still exists, like
Yes,
and what kind of businessman he was, and he could afford to build something that large, and
that's right. And D.H. Anderson was a son-in-law of Jay Goodnow, I believe. I think so. So he would be a very, very interesting person to talk to. Okay, one more quickly. So up here you have Lizzie Brockman. Now, I don't know why she's fascinated me so much over time, but I would like to talk to Lizzie Brockman. And she was just this, she's in her, I think, 90s in this picture, 80s in this picture, okay? She always walked wherever she went. She lived in a log cabin her whole life, but she would walk to Nashville every Saturday night and to the dances there, and she would always jig. She was always at the Canton homecomings, and she would jig. And we have a VHS tape here of her jigging. It has no sound to it. Of her jigging as a very old lady, and it's wonderful. But I can't find it, so we're looking for it. But she has just fascinated me. And so her neighbors remember her. She lived near Monmouth, and we'll show you her cabin. There's her cabin. She lived in that cabin her whole life. She was married for a time, but she would walk to Nashville. The person that told the neat stories about her was Agnes Tubbs, because they lived out there. Do you remember, Lana? They lived out there, and she would walk by their place, and she would stop and chat and have a glass of lemonade, and then walk on to. So they got to know her quite well. So Agnes tells the story, and this is in Forrest Tubbs's book. They tell the story of how she always wanted Agnes to come to her log cabin and see her log cabin. And so one time, Agnes walked with her, and she insisted that Agnes come up to her bedroom, because her bedroom was upstairs. And so she had to climb a ladder, go through just a little square hole in the floor. And when they got up there, Agnes said that the whole attic was full of bees. And that Agnes was just, petrified. Lizzie was so used to them, she didn't even realize they were there, I guess. But Agnes couldn't wait to get out of there and get away from those bees. But she was just such a fascinating little old lady, and she was just so spunky. And another story about her is that she raised pigs. And at one point she had sold her pigs, and she hid the money because, of course, Lizzie wasn't going to use a bank. And people knew that she had money because she had sold these pigs. And so she was there alone, and the thieves came. And they took a straight back chair out in the yard, and they tied her to this chair. And then they ransacked the place looking for the money. But they never found the money. And they went away and left her in front of this cabin tied to this chair. Well, she was a very resourceful little old lady, so she tipped the chair over, and she managed to crawl along, and they had locked the door on the way out of the cabin and threw the key. But she saw the direction the key went, so with this chair tied to her, she crawled over, and she was elderly by then. She crawled over, she found the key, she picked it up with her teeth, and she managed to unlock the door and get herself in her house, and eventually get herself the ropes worked loose and managed to free herself. They never found her money, though. She was very proud of that. She had hid it under the floorboards under her bed, and they never found her money. There's one more picture of her, I think. I wish we had more, but I just like to talk to her and hear some of her other stories. I know there's more.
Wow.
Any other stories? All right, you guys. Okay, we have one more picture. And, Erlene's gone. She talked about Red Hinton, and there he is. But this is one of the photos that Mark Streff found among some of his dad's stuff. His dad is in the picture. And so that's a story, a photo of postal workers in 1954. And in 1954, the post office was listed as the second busiest post office in the country for its classification. And of course, part of that reason was because of Clinton engine. So they were a busy, busy post office. And so I just wanted to say, I hope the day never comes when they decide to tear down our post office because they need to build something better and more modern. It's a wonderful thing, and it's so fun to think about those stairs and the people you might have met there. I'll be very sad if they tear that down, like our old courthouse. But every time you walk up those stairs, think about that. Think of who you might have met there. And someone told me yesterday, maybe it was Linda. Somebody told me that they just knew that there were 4 of our postal employees that are retiring. It was you. Okay, and do you know who they are? Tom.
Ron delivers down by you.
Okay.
He's retiring. Tom at the front desk.
We'll miss him.
Deb Brady Camp and someone else.
So we're going to lose 4 of our postal people. But just in closing, I just like to say, I was fortunate. I've lived all over this country. I've lived in big towns. I've lived in little towns. I've gone to many post offices over my day. I have never found one as accommodating, as friendly, as wonderful as the Maquoketa Post Office. And I just think we need to give them great credit. They are, some post offices in this country you go to and, they're wonderful.
Speaking of mail, when I worked at the area education agency, and we had inter-office mail between Clinton, Bettendorf, and that, and then there was a mail that just said Norma and AEA, and a teacher in Clinton had put it in the U.S. mail instead of the van mail. It got to Maquoketa, or it said Maquoketa AEA, and instead of it got to my house. And it didn't have my last name, but somebody at the post office said, oh, I know who works at the AEA, and it got in my mail at home.
Isn't that
Only in a
wonderful?
small town.
Only in a small town, and not even anymore in a small
And
town.
there was no postage on it.
Oh, and no postage.
Postage on it.
Those things are wonderful. That's awesome. Thank you. Any other story? Ah, Linda.
Well, Dick Struck was my mailman.
Okay.
I've been where I'm at 51 years now.
Okay,
And anyway, my mail was there between 10 and 10:15 every day.
without
And when Dick
fail.
carried the mail, it was there every day, 10 to 10:15.
Isn't that awesome? That's awesome. I did, in some of my research, I did read that even in like 1954, including their rural customers, these men delivered to over 8,000 people, even in 1854. So some of them were rural routes, but that's a lot. Okay, thank you so much. I'm so sorry for my technical difficulties, and I thank Sue and Mary for helping me. Thank you very much.